Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for another iteration of Resilient Landscaping, Gardening in the Defensible Space Zone. My name is Jennifer Roberts, and I will be your host this evening. I am an environmental educator with the UC Cooperative Extension and a member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, which is who is presenting tonight. We will have 3 presenters this evening. And then after that, we will switch over to a question and answer panel where our 3 presenters will be and another member of our coalition. So thank you for joining us. And I will hand it over to our first presenter of the evening, John Carnegie. John, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. And thank you all for joining us. This workshop, as Jen said, is Resilient Landscaping, Gardening in the Defensible Space Zone. And our workshop series is funded by a County of Sonoma Vegetation Management grant, and we thank them for their support in bringing this workshop to you this evening. Again, my name is John Carnegie. I'm a landscape designer with the Sonoma Ecology Center, and this workshop was created specifically for the Sonoma Valley community, although the wider community was invited as well. At the Sonoma Ecology Center, our mission is to work with the community to identify and lead actions that achieve and sustain ecological health in Sonoma. And as Jennifer said, I'm the first of 3 panelists, very pleased to be with you, talking about the subject of Firewise and sustainable landscaping. Before I move away from this title slide, let me direct your attention to the quote on it, or the subtitle, Garden as if Life Depends on It. It is from an author, a professor of entomology by the name of Doug Tallamy, who has written a number of books. Bringing Nature Home is one. I highly recommend it. And it refers to the importance of supporting habitat for wildlife in our home landscapes, because our own lives are very much connected to the natural world around us. And I'll be talking about some of that. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a webinar format. As you may have noticed, you do not have audio or video activated. The webinar is being recorded, you should know, and questions will be taken from the Q&A box only. So if you hover down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. You will also see a chat function, but we'd like to use that as much as possible to communicate some notes and things to you. And again, we'll prefer that you put your questions in the Q&A box. You will find throughout this presentation, the various speakers, we all have a very strong feeling about using native plants in our home landscapes, and I'll be explaining the reasons for that. The photograph shows a scene from my former lawn, but from now front yard, that is pretty much all native plants. And from back to front, the yellow is the Eriogonum umbulatum, a sulfur buckwheat. There's another pink buckwheat out of bloom here in the middle that you can just see, and then the lovely purple flower in the front is coyote mint, and you'll be learning and hearing more about native plants as we go through this workshop. So first of all, the Resilient Landscapes Coalition is a partnership that was formed several years ago. Sonoma resilientlandscapes.com down at the bottom is our website, and I encourage you to check that out. We'll be launching a new and improved website a little bit later this fall. And you should watch for that as well. So the team, the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, is made up of 4 partners: Fire Safe Sonoma, the Habitat Corridor Project, and April will be one of our speakers this evening, the founder of that organization. Sonoma Ecology Center, Ellie is here with us. She's a founding member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition and is on the board of directors for Sonoma Ecology Center. I'm John, again, from that organization. And the UC Master Gardener program for Sonoma County is represented this evening with Jennifer, who introduced you all to us this evening, and Mimi Enright will be the second speaker this evening. We also have done our work in partnership with the County of Sonoma Fire Prevention Division, with CAL FIRE, local fire departments over the past couple of years and recent months, making sure that our information has been well vetted with those folks as well. Okay, quick outline for this evening. I will begin, of course, with some fire context and some emphasis on ecology and sustainability. Then I'll turn it over to Mimi, who will follow with design and maintenance principles. And then April we'll close the formal presentations with some landscape design and planting examples, and then I'll leave plenty of time for questions and conversation. Again, those questions I hope you'll put into the Q&A box throughout the presentations, and we'll get to them at the end. Okay, so here we see a beautiful scene of a native herbaceous perennial. It's called coral bells or heuchera. It's growing in the shade of an oak canopy overhead, and it's providing nectar for insects and others, and shelter for birds and other wildlife. And it's an example of the kind of landscape that we'd like to help you to create. So we're talking about creating and tending landscapes for multiple benefits here. Fire safety for sure, but also beauty and wildlife habitat. Sometimes we talk about recovery of a forest after a wildfire, or there's forest recovery hikes and so forth, as if fire is something that's always bad and one has to recover from it. It's good to remember, though, that fire is a very natural and a very healthy part of many of our ecosystems in California and across the West. The loss of a home, though, of course, is catastrophic, very traumatic, and folks have sometimes responded to their concerns by clearing most of the vegetation from around their homes. That can result in problems of erosion, the growth of weeds, that become a fire problem in their own right, and certainly the loss of habitat. So sometimes what is seen are landscapes that, basically we call them a moonscape, nothing but gravel, in this case, very widely spaced boulders. Sometimes there will be the presence of a few, succulents or something. And then other folks will not be sure what to do and will just kind of be stunned into inactivity. And there can be, tremendous overgrowth of plants. They're not sure what to do. And it results in a real serious fire risk problem. So let's remember, first of all, that plants, thinking of this moonscape, plants are absolutely essential to all of life on Earth. Without plants, we have no oxygen to breathe, and we do not exist. Plants also, of course, contribute so many other things to a healthy environment, which I'll be discussing as I go into through the ecological portion. So this workshop, again, is all about creating defensible space that it's beautiful, that is sustainable, and is biodiverse. So speaking of biodiversity, many of us live in the Sonoma Valley because of its beauty. And we're coming to understand that the land is part of a healthy and beautiful native landscape is an element of fire. The watersheds in the Sonoma Valley are made up of grasslands and oak woodlands and other vegetation types, which were tended for thousands of years now by native people using fire as a tool to improve hunting and acorn harvest and desirable stands of plants for food and fiber. And these indigenous practices resulted in healthy wildlands where low intensity and frequent fire prevented the development of large fuel loads that invited these occasional catastrophic wildfires that are now putting lives and structures at risk. I'm really enjoying a book right now that I have here beside me called Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson. And this is all about how native Californians managed natural resources in many situations using fire, in other cases using pruning and the harvesting techniques and cultivation and so forth. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it. So our plant communities in much of the United States West are fire adapted systems, but a combination of fire suppression over the past century or two, along with climate change and warmer and drier conditions and more intense winds, have brought us occasional catastrophic wildfires. So while low intensity and frequent fire is part of a forest's natural cycle and is part of a healthy forest ecosystem, these catastrophic wildfires are costly, traumatic for unprepared landowners. And we now need to think about how to combine defensible space around our homes to make them more resilient with forest management that may utilize fire where that's appropriate, and it can use other management techniques where it isn't appropriate. So now we're becoming used, I think, to the idea of good fire or prescribed fire. And there's a lot of programs that are developing forest health, forest management programs around that. Catastrophic wildfire can not only shift species diversity, but also has huge environmental impacts. Because when structures burn, pollution is released to the air and water, and there's tremendous environmental costs of rebuilding and needing to source the concrete, the steel, and so forth. The exception of a couple of fires over this period, 1935 to 2014, most fires were relatively small compared to the ones that we've been seeing in recent years. So mostly within the 2,000 to 10,000 acres or less range. But in the past, or not in the past, but in this 6-year period that's shown here, just a few fires, Kincaid, Walbridge, Glass are a lot of these. We're seeing much larger fires over 50,000 acres. And so that's, could be due to a buildup of fuel loads in wildland, but also will be, definitely a reflection of changing climate conditions. And then we also have this other element of humans moving into the wildland. So where human development and wildlands meet, we call the wildland urban interface, or the WUI for short. So here's a couple of maps that are really interesting. They are 2 maps from 1964 and 2017 of the exact same area. So let me point out the red blob here, and it's much larger in the 2017 map, is Santa Rosa. And so Calistoga would be this, this red piece over on this side. And you can see how over the past 45 years, with the low density housing development in yellow and the high density in red, it's very much expanded to cover so much more of the 2017 map. So now overlaid as well is this pink outline of 2 fires that had a very similar footprint, and they moved roughly from Calistoga towards Santa Rosa, the Hanley fire in '64 and the 2017 Tubbs fire. So similar footprint, similar conditions, we are told by the authors, Keeley and Sifford, but you can tell that the 2017 fire would have a much greater impact on life and property because of our development into that area. And in fact, that was the case, much greater loss of life and greater loss of homes in the 2017 fire. So when you have expansion of the wildland urban interface, you're just going to have more ignitions from expansion of the power grid, more cars, more activity in the wildland. So greater loss of life and property, a greater need to suppress fire to prevent that loss of life. And then an additional problem, putting fire aside for a moment, the additional problem that wildlife habitat is that much more fragmented by all of this development, making it difficult for many plant and animal species and the entire ecological system to thrive. So let's have a quick look at risk and fire hazard severity, and then also mention some defensible space regulations that you should be aware of. So the considerations around risk, you're going to run from starting at a very broad regional level down to a sort of community level, and then very personal, looking at your own property and your own situation and your own tolerance of risk. So this map that I'll start with considers that first very broad landscape element. This is the CAL FIRE Fire Hazard Severity Zone map for Sonoma County. So the colored parts of the map are those areas that are within what's called the state responsibility area. And so this map has been created by CAL FIRE to define its area in terms of fire hazard, the yellow being moderate hazard, the orange is high, and the red is the very high area. So if you're looking on a small screen or something, where I'm highlighting here is the town of Sonoma with the valley running up along it. And you can see that very much to the north and northeast of the town of Sonoma is mostly mostly high fire hazard, with very high hazard here, kind of along the Sonoma-Napa County line, running up along the side of the valley. So definitely there's considerable risk in our area. Now, Sonoma County is working on updating their Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or CWPP. And that has a lot of really good information about risk and has some similar and updated and more refined maps around fire hazard, along with lots of other things. So I'm not sure if that's going into chat. If not, and you would like to see that Sonoma County CWPP, just Google those words, Sonoma County CWPP, and you'll easily find that hub. Some regulations that exist range from the state level. So the State Public Resources Code 4291 defines some requirements around creation of defensible space and a 0 to 5 foot ember resistant zone for the SRA. Some local ordinances will be from Sonoma County, an ordinance chapter 13A, and also the city of Sonoma has requirements around defensible space for the community served by the Sonoma Valley Fire District. Also, you should be aware that additional requirements are on their way in 2023. We expect some new code around the area closest to the home in high and very high fire hazard severity zones. And so we're watching for those as our other organizations, and we'll help to inform you as soon as those are kind of written into law. Getting back to the subject of assessment of risk, again, we start at a very broad level and kind of think about the vegetation patterns and fuel loads and things in the landscape, in the broad landscape around us. But then we begin to dial in a little bit towards our own situation, think about the resources and the conditions in your own neighborhood, sort of the street network, the access for fire protection, our ability to evacuate, and then come in a little bit closer and think about the conditions on your own property. So including topography, if you are out at that wildland urban interface, there might be enough slope that you're at the top of a hill or in a canyon, and that sort of topography is very important. And think too about whether the house has been assessed and whether home hardening practices have been completed. If so, then what steps should be taken working out into the landscape? Because what repeated to you during this presentation will be that you want to start with the home itself and then work incrementally out into the landscape. You'll want to consider what your own personal perspective is on risk, how you balance risk and other factors such as sustainability goals, aesthetics of a landscape, home improvement costs. And of course, all of this does need to be done in accordance with whatever law and code and regulations might apply to you from the state, from a local municipality, even from a homeowners association. So each individual must assess their own personal risk and tolerance, but also remember that your risk decisions intersect with those of your neighbors. So if neighbors fail to take certain steps, that might put you at greater risk, and vice versa. And so want to consider that as well. Okay, let's look at the 3 types of fire exposure to a home during a wildfire event. Radiant heat is when the heat of a burning structure can cause ignition of, say, the siding of your home, something like that. So that's one possibility. Another is direct flame contact, where a burning forest, for example, or wildland burns right up to the property line and continues right up to the house. And while those two are possible, what happens by far in the majority of situations is what is called embers. So embers are little tiny bits of burning vegetation that float around from the leading front of the fire. And these will float from the fire, a good half a mile or a mile or more. And these embers will sort of rain down, or snow is maybe a little bit more appropriate, snow down on the property, landing on the roof, landing all over the property, and blowing like snow flurries up against the foundation of the home and into the valleys and the corners of the roof and of the walls. And so that kind of that influences defensible space guidelines. We want to be thinking about our weaknesses in those areas where embers are likely to accumulate. This is what an ember storm can look like, and so it's dramatic. It's the greatest cause of structure ignition, and again, your house may be the greatest fire threat to your neighbors if you're not taking steps. Once a single house in a neighborhood is ignited, then there is that radiant heat factor that can cause that fire to spread to neighboring structures. So think of your home and landscape. It might look something like this, but then imagine dropping into that a rain of embers, and think about where are they likely to ignite, where they land. It might be dry leaves or dried grass flowers. How will it move? Is there spacing between plants, or is it continuous vegetation that can allow it to move it around? Are there structures? Are there pathways that will break that movement of fire, or rock walls, that sort of thing? And then also think, how does it move up into the canopy of trees if trees are on the property? We very much want to have trees on our property, but need to think about a vertical separation between the plants underneath them and the canopy above. Of course, again, start the whole line of thinking with the idea that thousands of embers are going to land on the roof itself, and that needs to be clean of any debris, and you need to think about home hardening that can be done in that area around vents and gutter guards and so forth. All right, and then let's have a look at ecology before we get a little deeper into the defensible space guidelines with Mimi and her presentation. So human development has destroyed and fragmented much of our wildlands, and so we need to think of forests and grasslands and chaparral. We tended to think of forests and grasslands and chaparral as the home for wildlife, but these wildlands are now so chopped up and so fragmented into bits that our home landscapes are needed to provide these critical linkages of habitat. So I'll bring up the name of Doug Tallamy again. He's the author of the book Bringing Nature Home and many others, and has a number of presentations on YouTube, including one that he did just a couple of weeks ago in a series hosted by the Sonoma County Land Trust. Anyway, he promotes these ideas of making gardens into habitat oases, and he opens the book Bringing Nature Home with this quote: "For the first time in history, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife." So again, it's not something for the parks and the park rangers and so forth. We must kind of accept this role that home gardeners can have, not only with in the sense of habitat, but our defensible space, our home landscapes can provide all of these ecosystem services and more. Shade in the form of sort of air conditioning our homes and reducing the need for mechanical air conditioning. Aesthetics, humans are just so much happier and healthier in beautiful plant-rich settings, and that's been borne out in many studies. They enrich soil and hold it in place. They clean and manage stormwater, sequester carbon, and again, support birds and other pollinators with rich biodiversity. I love this image in particular because it's showing insects, and insects are so important, and we rely on them, or so many animals rather rely on them either directly or indirectly for food. Without insects, there wouldn't be, in fact, much other higher life. Insects are uniquely able to convert plant material, which are at the very center of the web of life, and they are that thing that can convert it into other forms of food to feed birds and reptiles and amphibians and so much other higher life. We've been hearing a lot lately about significant loss of insect biodiversity, as much as 75 or 80% over the last few decades. The Western monarch butterfly is sort of the most visible, the most talked about of those examples. The European honeybee, although that's not a native insect, also we hear a lot about. But of course, there are so many insect species. Many of them we don't give a lot of thought to, but they have an important role, again, either as food, or they're a decomposer, or they are a natural enemy and are helping to control possible pest populations. So studies have shown that this loss of habitat that we're seeing is often caused, the loss of habitat is a primary driver of this insect decline, along with pesticide use and climate change. So it's important that we take steps to protect and create habitat as we manage wildland fuels and our landscapes. And simply put, native plants like these that are shown in this photo provide better habitat and resources for native insects. And our insects are primary food sources for birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals, and others. So how do we support biodiversity? April is going to give lots of examples of native plants that do so well in our Sonoma County and Sonoma Valley gardens. So we want to choose native plants most of the time. Studies show that certain bird species that have been studied, for example, will thrive. Populations will build if they're mostly native plants in home landscapes where they're living. I'm thinking of a chickadee study done by this Douglas Tallamy and his research team. So we're kind of using that 70% number as a good goal. So choose native plants most of the time, but that still leaves 20 or 30% for favorite non-natives. A lemon tree, a favorite camellia, some heirloom plant that we got from a family member. Native plants will improve biodiversity by providing food, fruits, and seeds, leaves, and insects to wildlife that have evolved with these plants over millennia. But it's how we put these native plants together also that's important. We want to put them together in islands or clusters of plants, and that provides so much wildlife, food for wildlife and shelter for wildlife. We'll find that these islands then serve well. They can be separated with a sort of a fire break, like a pathway or something, that makes a very good Firewise complement. We want to use integrated pest management to avoid using insecticide or other pesticides. We want to provide a water source, and note that insects do specialize on specific plants, and they can't survive or reproduce without those specific ones that they've evolved with. Another way to support biodiversity is to take good care of trees, and oak trees in particular. Oaks are a keystone species, meaning that they're so closely connected to other species that if they were removed, the impacts would be tremendous. So here's a photo of an oak woodland with an understory, again, of coral bells, which is drought tolerant and won't damage the root system. Oak trees are incredibly productive food factories for wildlife. So we show this little caterpillar down here, because oak trees will host many caterpillars that do not, cause harm to the oak tree. They're easily able to support them in most circumstances. And the caterpillars are just tremendously important food for birds in particular. Even birds that we think of as being seed eaters, because we invite them to our bird feeders and they come, but they often eat a lot of insects as well. And when they're raising their young, they must feed those young on insects, in particular caterpillars. So of course, oaks also provide acorns, and so are supporting acorn eaters of birds and mammals. So acorns feed over, in fact, 100 vertebrate species, including squirrels, deer, and many birds. So we want to keep oak trees healthy for the habitat they provide, but also because a declining tree can be very fire prone, and this is true of all plants. It's important to protect the root system, including minimizing any irrigation, again, around oak trees specifically, because they are well adapted to a summer dry climate. So often irrigation in the summertime is not particularly helpful to an oak tree. There are some exceptions to that. And we want to avoid compaction or digging within the drip line or even beyond where that's possible. And it's also very important to have a couple of inches of leaf litter. Leaf litter supports insects and birds, microorganisms, supports a healthy root system and healthy soils. Another way to enhance biodiversity is to prevent the invasion of exotic weedy plants. So in the larger photo, this is two photos, one overlaid laid over the other. This one shows what appears to be really aggressive over clearing of a slope, leaving a lot of disturbed soil. And this is a different photo, but shows how Scotch broom will very quickly invade disturbed sites. Scotch broom is an invader from the Mediterranean, I believe the Mediterranean region, not sure why it's called Scotch. Maybe it's from Scotland, but is a major weedy pest in our county and is very, very fire prone as well. There will, you may be thinking along as you receive these guidelines about defensible space, about removing certain vegetation, pruning other vegetation. So the timing of this sort of vegetation management is important. Birds are nesting March through August, and so we want to do most of our sort of major vegetation management in those other months of September through February. This is also when most plants are dormant and a lot of good pruning can be done during this time. I'll touch quickly on a few more defensible space ecosystem services that plants provide, covering and protecting soil, holding it in place, which means keeping soil out of streams and rivers, and so generally improving the health of a watershed. Also, plants do carbon sequestration, and they encourage water to infiltrate in the watershed and contribute to groundwater. Here's a quick review of carbon sequestration. So plants, you'll recall, use photosynthesis to capture carbon dioxide out of the air, combine it with other things to create the materials, the carbohydrates and proteins and so forth for building plant cells, leaves, and roots, and so forth. This is food for herbivores, but also, as leaves drop and as root cells die, that often contributes carbon into the soil, which is a tremendous storage place for carbon and keeping it out of the atmosphere and reducing the greenhouse gas contribution to climate change. Soils, in fact, are capable of holding tremendous amounts of carbon, more than the atmosphere and more than above ground plant parts and animal life combined. So it's really an underutilized resource. Carbon sequestration requires many healthy plants. Trees do it, especially well, being that much larger, and healthy soils that require diverse active microbial communities. So speaking of those healthy soils, it's a complex network that includes plant roots and insects and fungi, organic matter, which is supplied by fallen leaves and organic mulch, and can be augmented as well with compost. So we want to retain and incorporate organic matter. We want to keep soil covered with plants, with mulch, with leaf litter, where these things are appropriate. So we'll learn some guidelines about how it is not appropriate to have, or may not be appropriate to have, that mulch and leaf litter very near the house. We also want to avoid synthetic fertilizers, which tend to burn up organic matter. A final slide, a little bit about cleaning and managing water. We want to try to keep water on our property once it's on it, as much as possible, using the motto, slow it, spread it, sink it, and store it, referring to stormwater that falls on our property. So we want to slow it down, spread it out in places like like a bioswale or some sort of retention basin. We want to allow it to sink into the ground and store it, have it contribute to groundwater. This kind of landscape feature is not intended to be a year-round pond. It's just intended to hold water temporarily so that it can soak into the ground. Now, there's other water that enters our property, and we can try to keep it there by, for example, plumbing our laundry washing machine to use the gray water as a landscape irrigation source. We can also collect water and store it in tanks for some limited summertime irrigation. So you can find more resources like these at the dailyaxe.org website, a great Petaluma-based organization that does a lot of work in that area. So with that, I will turn it over to Mimi Enright, Program Manager for the UC Master Gardener Program of Sonoma County. And Mimi will talk about design and maintenance principles for the defensible space. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Fantastic as always. Do you want to do a stop share and perfect. We'll do a little logistics here in a minute while I get set up, everybody. All right. So good evening, everybody. So nice to see the participation from actually all over the state. I think I saw someone from Ojai who's joining us tonight. So welcome. I'm very happy to have everyone joining us. Thank you, John. As John said, I'm the program coordinator for the UC Master Gardener program here in Sonoma County. And hopefully many of you are familiar with who Master Gardeners are and what we do. We are trained agents of the University of California, and our mission is to extend the educational outreach of UC to our communities. We do that with a focus on sustainable landscape principles as our core message. And our goal as the Resilient Landscapes Coalition is really to marry those sustainable landscape principles with Firewise landscaping. Why is that important? As John so eloquently shared, there's critical ecosystem services that our landscapes provide, but our climate is changing, and so are our landscapes. And we truly believe that each property can and should make a difference if they can. So I'm going to be sharing some basic information with you about defensible space and design and maintenance opportunities you have to create a more Firewise and sustainable landscape moving forward. Hopefully this gives you a framework for assessing your own landscape with a Firewise lens. The picture on this slide is in the hills above my home. I live northeast of Cloverdale by about 5 minutes in the old Preston faith healing community from the late 1800s. I live in a very high fire severity zone on a slope directly abutting wildlands. So that means that my risk fire, as John discussed, is very high. Again, as John iterated, each of us needs to be assessing our own risk as we plan our actions to increase our safety during a wildfire. Okay, so I have a lot of territory to cover in a very short amount of time. I'm going to do a quick touch on some basic principles. then discuss how to design your home landscape with fire in mind based on the different zones in the 0 to 100 foot perimeter around your home or structures on your property. Do a quick review of mulch and ongoing maintenance, which is one of the most important aspects of continuing to keep our properties ready, as we can before the next fire. So let's dive on in. Okay, so here's the bottom line. What you do to prepare your home and landscape for the next fire truly matters. We know what the truths are in this slide. Your actions to prepare for the next wildfire are key. And we all know how hard our firefighters have worked to protect our homes and communities. But given the scope of the wildfires that we've seen, we know that we can't assume that there's going to be a shiny red truck parked outside of your home when the fire does come. So attending this workshop is a really great first step, but just coming to the meeting really isn't enough. We're hoping you're gonna identify at least a few tips to take away from this meeting so you can start taking action, get started taking action so we're all a little better prepared and our homes, family, community, and firefighters are perhaps a little more safe. Okay, I want to cover a few basics about fire and fuel, which are really important to the context of our conversation today. So very simply, fire must have 3 elements in order to burn, and that's fuel, oxygen, and heat. Truly the only element of those 3 that we can control is fuel. And fuel very basically is anything that will burn, right? Anything that can range from vegetation in our landscape mulch, fencing, roof decks, lawn furniture, arbors, trellises, planter boxes. We really need to see all those as potential fuel in a future fire. So John discussed the 3 types of fire threats to structures. And defensible space strategies have historically focused on how to reduce direct flame contact. But preparing for embers and radiant heat exposures takes a different approach. So we really have been seeing, even in the few years that we've been working together as the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, an evolution of defensible space recommendations, with particular focus on a new zone called Zone 0, as well as the critical importance of home hardening. So here are our basic Firewise landscaping principles. Resilient landscape design is about plant selection and placement, overall garden design with hardscape elements, and maintenance. And then we hope all of this is done with a lens of sustainability that John did such a great job discussing, such as retaining water on your property, conserving water and energy, supporting wildlife, and sequestering carbon. So I want to stress there isn't scientific research that supports all of our recommendations. I will point out through this presentation where recommendations are supported by scientific research. And also as we go through this presentation, any items you see highlighted in red represent Sonoma County Code requirements. So let's start with some key basic foundational recommendations to make your landscape more firewise. You want to make sure you're removing all dead or dying plants and branches and remove ladder fuels. You want to focus on creating islands of plantings, optimally with non-combustible paths between them to interrupt the path of fire. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to structures. And you want to make sure you're pruning up tree limbs at least 6 feet or 1/3 of the tree height from the ground. And we'll spend some more time talking about that concept, about all those concepts. I wanted to start off by stressing how important it is to make sure that you don't have anything that directly connects to your home that is organic, that could transmit fire to your structures. And that definitely includes wooden gates and fencing, as well as hedges and even wooden edging around plant beds that might attach directly to your home. So you want to see if you can consider alternatives for those, particularly fencing or gates in inorganic materials such as metal. So hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of ladder fuels. The goal is to reduce the possibility of having fire move up from the ground plane into the crown of trees. So you really want to make sure you avoid planting shrubs under trees. If you do have shrubs under trees, or you're planting shrubs under trees, you want to make sure you allow at least 3 times the height of the shrub between it and the lowest tree limb. And again, you want to make sure you're limbing up all tree limbs at least 6 feet from the ground or one third the height of the tree. And then it's critical to continue to maintain that as the tree and shrubs grow. Here's some work that our colleague Ellie did at her property to remove some ladder fuels, in this case, an older juniper shrub below a tree. And then on the lower left, that picture shows cleanup work she did to the interior of a juniper shrub that she left to clean out old dead branches and debris. And you can see the before picture on the left, upper left, with that juniper shrub directly underneath that tree. And what Ellie did, she said, and she assures us that it's a little deceptive from the picture, but what she did was clear back the juniper shrub from the tree and then made sure that she had that 3 times the height of that juniper shrub clearance to the lowest tree limb. So how can you apply a Firewise lens to plant selection? So many of you may be hoping for a fire-resistant plant list, but the reality is that all plants can burn. So it's much more important to consider where you place that plant in your landscape and then how you maintain it. You want to make sure that you're choosing plants that will grow to a size that's appropriate for their location. So when you pick up that little 4-inch pot at the nursery, you need to really pay attention to what its mature size will be and where you're planning to put it in the landscape. And you want to make sure you're locating plants where excess pruning is not required to maintain desired spacing. Are you putting the plant somewhere that it will thrive? If it's a plant that prefers shade, are you putting it in full sun? Are you up for the maintenance that plant require? In fact, what's your appetite for ongoing maintenance in your landscape? Is the plant invasive? Will it spread to a neighbor's property and create a fire threat? And how might a plant change over its lifespan? Lavender is a really great example. It's kind of a ubiquitously used shrub here in wine country. It starts out as herbaceous and becomes much more woody over time. So after being deeply enmeshed in this topic, I've really started to see a landscape through a different lens. And I think about how fire will move through the landscape around my home and how much fuel exists in that landscape that would add to a fire. How much woody mass is there? So with this lens last winter, for example, I cut back some larger salvias that had become really very woody. And they grew back beautifully last spring with much more herbaceous, non-woody stems with much less woody mass. They'll become woody again in a year or two, and I will cut them back again. But if you don't want to do this kind of regular maintenance, then plant selection for how a plant will change over time is an important consideration as well. So where shouldn't we be planting? Well, there's some very specific recommendations that we're going to be talking about in more detail in the 0 to 5 foot zone around your home and structures. That's called Zone 0, and it's a newer zone in the Defensible Space lexicon. You don't want to be planting under vents or eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, under or near decks, and in those inside corners of houses. The wind can particularly spin up during a fire and create more complex fire ignition situations in those corners of homes. Okay, so let's dive into the zones that make up that 0 to 100 foot defensible space around your home and structures. So your starting point is your house. And we're not going into the topic of home hardening today, as our focus is on the landscape. But there are lots of really incredible resources to help guide you through the home hardening process. So this graphic depicts the different defensible space zones in your home landscape that we're going to be discussing today. So after you've done the work to harden your home, then you want to move out to the 0 to 5 foot zone around your structures, then to 5 to 30 feet, and then to 30 to 100 feet. Okay, so the first zone we're going to discuss is Zone 0, or the Ember Defense Zone. And as I mentioned, this is a relatively newer zone introduced in the defensible space recommendations. In fact, when we first started doing these workshops a number of years ago, we were having a really hard time finding graphics that even depicted the Zone 0, that 0 to 5 foot zone. So I want to stress that this zone is supported by scientific research. Zone 0 reduces the likelihood of structure ignition by reducing the potential for direct ignition of the structure from flame contact, by embers that could accumulate at the base of a wall, and or indirect ignitions when embers ignite vegetation. vegetative debris or other combustible materials located close to a structure that result in either a radiant heat or a direct flame contact exposure to the structure. This zone is closest to the house, so it requires the most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. So classically, we have massed shrubs against the house called foundation shrubs. So this is really a big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. But we really need to think about the fuel that generates for fire in immediate proximity to our homes or structures. Optimally, there should be no combustible materials in this zone. At a minimum, you want to make sure you remove planting or minimize planting in more vulnerable places where fire could enter your home, such as under those vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, and under or near decks. And as we discussed, no fences or wood gates attached to the house, as they can move fire directly to your home. And again, that also applies to hedges. So as John discussed during a wildfire, thousands of embers can rain down on roofs and pelt the sides of homes like hail during a storm. And embers coming into contact with flammable material is the major reason why homes are destroyed during wildfires. So I want to emphasize that we aren't suggesting that you have to remove trees if you have existing trees in your 0 to 5 foot zone. Trees provide important shade during the summer to reduce energy needs inside your home. The most important aspect to consider with trees closer to your home is what debris they drop that you then need to maintain on your roof and in the zones immediately around the structures. So it can make your maintenance easier if you remove any limbs within 6 feet of your roof. But then you also want to make sure you're focusing on regularly removing any dead or dry plant material in zone 0. So during a red flag warning day, or if you have to evacuate your house due to a fire, you want to make sure if you have the time to clean up any debris in this zone around your structures and on your roof. For example, I have an oak tree that drops twigs, acorns, and leaves nearly year-round in my 0 to 5 foot defensible space zone. So I'm out on all those red flag warning days to clean up any debris that's accumulated in my 0 to 5 foot zone. I want to stress that it is a county code, Sonoma County code requirement to cut any tree limbs within 10 feet of a stovepipe or a chimney outlet. And then you need to make sure you're maintaining that spacing year-round. Okay, so now let's move on to zone 1, or the 5 to 30 foot zone. This is commonly referred to as the home defense zone. This is likely where firefighters will make a stand if they are working to defend your home from a wildfire. So you want to make sure you keep that in mind to ensure that they have ease of access. Zone 1 reduces the likelihood of fire burning directly to the structure, and that's accomplished by modifying fuels and creating a discontinuity between planting groups that limits pathways for fire to burn to the structure. And it also reduces the potential for near to building ember generation and radiant heat exposures. So the recommendation for this zone is to plant in islands or groupings of plants that are separated by pathways. In a higher risk area, you might want to consider making those pathways non-combustible in the 5 to 30 foot zone. To reiterate, the goal is to interrupt the flow of fire to your home. Plantings in this zone should optimally be herbaceous, which means non-woody, and 3 feet in height or less. You can consider inclusion of a shrub or a tree, but optimally it would be a specimen or a single tree or shrub mat rather than masses. Again, it's bringing that lens of how much woody mass is there in these different zones around your structures. You want to ensure that all plants are accessible for regular maintenance, as you want to make sure you're keeping all plants in this zone clear of any dead plant material. And this is a really great zone for incorporating hardscape such as patios. So the basics in zone 1 from a design lens are low growing, mostly perennial plants that are well maintained, considering inclusion of hardscape to break up those planted areas. And here's a Santa Rosa home with a dry creek bed, which is a really great use of hardscape for plant grouping separation in 5 to 30 foot zone, and also helps with water retention when we get rain events. Okay, now let's move on to zone 2, or the 30 to 100 foot zone, which is called the reduced fuel zone. And actions in this zone are designed to reduce the potential behavior of an oncoming fire in such a way as to drop the approaching fire from the crown to the ground. So we have the same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrubs and trees in more widely spaced groups. You want to continue your focus on creating islands of vegetation, ensuring you have easy access for maintenance, and wider pathways can help facilitate that access, and to continue your vigilance on ladder fuel removal and regularly removing dead plant material. It is a Sonoma County code requirement that all annual grasses must be mowed to 4 inches in height during fire season. And you want to make sure you move any wood piles to this zone. Often we move wood piles directly next to the house during winter, but you want to make sure you're moving that back out away from the house into your 30 to 100 foot zone during fire season, with nothing combustible located near the pile within 10 feet in all directions. So these are CAL FIRE recommendations, and I want to stress that they're recommendations. These aren't supported by scientific research for plant spacing guidelines within 100 feet of your home. I want to again stress these are not mandated by law or supported by scientific research, but are the best recommendations from our firefighting professionals based on their experiences. These guidelines for spacing are due to flame height and are a direct correlation to the slope of the land around the home, which is a major consideration in assessing wildfire risk. I'm sure as we're all aware, a fire will burn faster and more intensely uphill than along flat ground. And a steeper slope will result in a faster moving fire with longer flame lengths. So this graphic is depicting shrub spacing, and low growing, well irrigated grasses, ground covers, or perennials are considered to be acceptable between these plant groupings. But again, each of us needs to assess our overall risk with degree of slope, our fire severity risk in our own home environment to make appropriate decisions in our own home landscapes. So this graphic is depicting suggested horizontal tree spacing as well as vertical separation, those ladder fuels that we discussed earlier. Note again that 3 times the height of the shrub, from the top of the shrub to the lowest tree branch. So horizontal spacing on less than a 20% slope of 10 feet is recommended. And on steeper slopes, of course, that recommended distance is increased. So we just want to really make sure we're stressing that we don't have to denude our landscapes in this 100-foot perimeter around our home, but we do want to ensure that we have spacing to reduce the fuel volume and help break up the flow of fire to the home or any structures. So here's a great East Bay mud graphic that shows before and after maintenance for an existing mature landscape. In the before on the upper left, we see no break in planted areas and shrubs massed against the house. And after maintenance, we see islands of vegetation. The shrubs next to the house have been removed, trees have been limbed up, and ladder fuels removed, and shrubs and trees thinned. You also want to make sure that you, your family, and firefighters have clear access in and out of your property. What would you do to make this driveway more firewise? Well, it's really similar vegetation management principles as in Zone 2. You want to cut those grasses back to 4 inches in height and limb up those trees. And it's important, it's recommended by firefighting officials to maintain the vegetation on both sides of roads and driveway 10 feet from the road edge and 15 feet up vertically. And you want to ensure that you have at least 12 feet of unobstructed pavement for the passage of vehicles. So once you've done the work to harden your home and prepare your defensible space, you really want to reach out to and work with your neighbors. Work together to develop a fuel reduction plan. Watch for maintenance needed and really consider the total volume of vegetation in the area. And if you reside in a more densely forested area, you can control fire behavior by reducing ladder fuels, opening up the tree canopy, and maintaining ground fuels. This will help firefighters with fire suppression during a fire. So oftentimes this wildland urban interface will be beyond your 100-foot zone, but in this example, this picture is in my 30 to 100-foot zone around my cottage. So this is wonderful shaded fuel break work that my neighbors have done in this area that I can assure you helps me sleep a lot more soundly at night, knowing that that work is done, because this is likely the direction that fire would come if threatening our homes. So again, you really want to consider in the context, especially if you're in a very high fire severity zone, directly adjacent to wildland or urban interface, doing some shaded fuel break work to help improve your fire preparedness. This is another shot from my home. This is actually a shot from my 0 to 5 foot zone, looking across to my neighbor's property, again, within my 100-foot defensible space zone. In fact, within my 30-foot defensible space zone. I'm not sure if you can see it very clearly, but my neighbor has done some of that shaded field break work up the hill in the wildland behind her homes. That's actually a pile of brush that was waiting to be chipped earlier this year by the free chipping program here in Sonoma County. It is an ongoing process with all the maintenance needed every year and incremental improvements to make our homes and neighborhoods better prepared for future fires. And it's really wonderful. All the wonderful COPE groups that have sprung up around Sonoma County. If you haven't joined your local COPE group, I highly recommend it, and they can help you in working on neighborhood plans. So I talked about the critical importance of maintenance. So throughout the year, you need to be continuously monitoring for needed maintenance. It is a county code requirement to regularly remove any dead plants and branches from trees and shrubs. And it is recommended to remove vines from trees and shrubs, so you're not creating a path for fire to move from a ground plane up into a tree. Here are recommendations to be done annually before fire season. John did a really great job talking about when to do your pruning and vegetation thinning. Now's the time, fall and early winter, so we avoid any potential harm to bird breeding season. You don't want to cut your grasses to bare dirt. It's important to keep some viable vegetation in place for erosion control. We want to be particularly sensitive about dry leaf litter at the beginning of fire season. John did a great job of talking about the important ecological benefits that leaf litter provide. We should probably start paying attention to that as early as May or June. For example, in my scenario, I have some heavy leaf litter from some oak trees that I have to keep removed from my 0 to 5 foot zone. And then I do have oak trees in my 5 to 30 foot zone. So I do some leaf litter removal, but I also leave some. I had a really very probably 4-inch thick layer of leaf duff that I thinned down a bit to help reduce my fire risk at the start of fire season. Then every few years as needed, you want to go in and make sure you're thinning and reducing tree canopies to remove any twiggy growth. And making sure you're maintaining that separation between trees and reducing your overall fuel load. Again, you want to make sure you're maintaining ladder fuel concepts with tree limbs limbed up at least 6 feet from the ground. Cut back any ground covers and vines to remove any buildup of dry stems and leaves. I actually did that this spring. I had a native clematis on a mesh fence outside my home. And it had all this dead leaf and dry stem buildup in it. And I cut it back hard, and it rejuvenated beautifully. So you also want to keep an eye to cutting back shrubs to renew them as well. And April will do a great job of touching on that topic around native plant recommendations. So mulch is an incredibly important aspect of a sustainable landscape. It helps with weed suppression and water conservation, especially given our severe drought situation that we're in here in Sonoma County. Incredibly important. Wood mulches are organic, and as such, they're combustible materials which can transmit fire. So it's recommended to not use mulch in a widespread or continuous manner. The recommendation is to choose larger size chips of wood mulch. Picture on the left shows composted wood chips from some trees that were actually chipped on the property I live on that had been left in place to compost. On the right, that's gorilla hair mulch. No gorilla hair mulch. So this is actually a picture from Fire Safe Marin, and you can see how embers landed in the gorilla hair mulch. It's that really finely shredded, hairy bark. That type of mulch can tend to smolder. So the risk is that firefighters can move on to defend another property, and those embers can flare up and spread fire to your home. Composted wood chips demonstrated the least hazardous fire behavior overall of 8 mulch treatments that were tested in a study by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California. It's my understanding that there's a new mulch study that's being done using mulch materials that are more commonly used in our regions. I'm really looking forward to when that will be released. The recommendation is to use 2 to 3 inches of mulch in your islands of planting. Again, in higher fire risk areas, you might want to consider separating those mulched areas with non-combustibles and ignition resistant materials such as concrete, gravel, rock, or a native grass lawn in your 5 to 30 foot zone. And here's some great pictures depicting some hardscape separating some mulched areas of planting. And again, the scientifically supported recommendation is for no organic mulch in the 0 to 5 foot zone, particularly for higher fire risk areas. And we didn't touch on it, but there is a new state of California legislation coming out that's going to mandate the 0 to 5 foot zone in high fire risk areas, specifically in the SRA, the state responsibility from area that in that map that John referred to, as well as very high fire severity zones in the LRA. So get ahead of the curve if you're in one of those areas by implementing your 0 to 5 foot zone now. So here's a quick recap on the Firewise design considerations in the defensible space zone that we talked about. In your 0 to 5 foot zone, from your house and structures, you want to make sure you use no organic materials if possible, or optimally you're using inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones. In the 5 to 30 foot zone from the house, you want to plant in islands with materials such as low herbaceous perennials, grasses or succulents, and specimen or individual shrubs or trees. And then in that 30 to 100 foot zone, the same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone. Excuse me, but you can include shrub or tree groupings and spaced groups separated by areas that break up the spread of wildfire. Again, ongoing maintenance is essential for a Firewise landscape. Particularly with the drought, you're going to want to be monitoring trees and shrubs closely and removing dead or dying branches. You want to prune out any dead material that can build up from the interior shrubs if possible. And if you're prioritizing removal of plants due to the drought, you might consider removal of any shrubs under trees to remove any possible ladder fuels. A lot of information, but hopefully it's given you a framework for assessing your landscape and making it more Firewise. For more information, we have many resources on our Resilient Landscapes Coalition website, as well as our UC Master Gardener Program of Sonoma County website. We also have lots of content on waterwise gardening and much, much more. Highly recommend. If you haven't been to our website, you go check it out. Here's our web page link, and you're also always welcome to send your questions to our Master Gardener Information Desk via the email listed. And that is it for me. And I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, April Owens from the Habitat Corridor Project.
Thank you, Mimi. Gosh, it's so hard to go after these two wonderful presentations. So I've been adjusting my workshop, my portion of this workshop, and I'm really trying to show you all some actionable steps. And I want you to add your questions into the Q&A or chat wherever you need, because I'm gonna wrap up around 7:05, so we have a really vibrant amount of time for questions. So let's see. I need to share my screen. Just 1 second. Sorry, I was so engaged in the workshop that I lost my workshop, my slideshow. All right.
April always likes to say, get up and wiggle around.
I know, I like to wiggle around. Like, it's a good time to wiggle around. So now I will share my screen. And anybody want to put some of their thoughts in the chat? So is this showing up? Ellie, are you seeing this?
Not yet. Not yet, April.
Okay, sorry.
Hang in there, because April's got the most beautiful slides and the most.
She does.
Not
Everybody
everybody.
got some good stuff, but I'm like
True.
having a moment of like, I'm having a moment
You need
here.
to do all the sexy plants.
I do, but I don't know what's going on here. So here we go.
Nothing more stressful for a presenter than
Oh,
not
it's
getting your
fine. I
presentation
don't know
to
what's
share.
going on.
And it's also true that this is probably the 15th presentation that we've all done together, and I'm not exaggerating. So April definitely knows how to get her slides up.
I know. I don't know what's going on. So I don't know what's happening for a moment. So I'm in the Zoom. I apologize, y'all.
Take your time. This is definitely wiggle around time. Get a drink of water. I haven't even been talking, but I'm already hoarse.
Like I haven't even like, so I'm on our Zoom.
So you've got your presentation open, right?
I got my presentation open.
On a web browser, and then you hit share screen and you click the web browser window. I'd grab your presentation from the last one, but I know you said you changed this one around a lot.
I did. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time with this. Okay.
And while she's doing that, I noticed that Jen put in, and I had.
Oh gosh, here we go. Thank you. Keep going.
There's a, we
Because
do,
I'm just
we
being,
do
I'm being super silly.
we do a maintenance workshop as well, so that once you've got your plants in it, and Jennifer goes into great detail about how to do the maintenance, and that we have done in the past. So you can go to our website, SonomaResilientLandscapes.com, and see the ones that we've done in the past. And the next one is in November. Okay,
Great
April.
plug, Ellie.
Thanks. Sorry for my like little brain fart.
That's the end of a long day.
I think you can see what's going on now. Thank y'all. I've got that slang from Mimi now because she was just in Savannah.
I
So
was just in Savannah, Georgia. Yes.
so I am here finally. Sorry, I hope you got a chance to wiggle around, go to the restroom, and get some water. So we are at 6:38, and I'm gonna try to get around 7:05 so that we have plenty of time for question and answer. So every time we do these workshops, I get the privilege of like shifting around my pictures and trying to focus on where we are, which is Sonoma Valley. But it sounds like we have people from all over Sonoma County and California. So that's really fun. So this was my last visit to Sonoma Van Hoosier Preserve that Sonoma Ecology Center is so involved with, and they've been doing amazing work with fires and supporting wildflowers. So I wanted to like get us grounded in Sonoma Valley. And I was so delighted as we walked out, it was March last year, that we came across this wonderful swallowtail butterfly working a Clarkia. So I am April Owens, and I have a few hats that I love to wear. My first one is as the executive director of the Habitat Corridor Project. And our mission is to promote California native plant restoration gardens and help y'all see and gardens and see native plants. So we have a lot of habitat gardens around Sonoma County, and we are launching a lot of really fun work days and really reinvigorating this whole demonstration garden idea coming up in the fall. We have a newsletter if you head over to our website. And I and Nancy Bauer, the co-founder, like to just help you with really simple newsletters, like how do I plant 50 milkweed or some plants. So it's really actionable steps. I also am a member of the California Native Plant Society, Milo Baker, which I completely recommend if you are diving into native plants, because I'm the speaker of native plants here, along with our other group. But so we have, if you join CNPS, you get some magazines. There's a lot of resources. There's next weekend is our plant sale, which is amazing. So if you're a member, you get to come to the Friday night, super secret fun night, and then pre-sale. And then on Saturday is our big sale. And last year we sold out by like noon. And then I also am a landscape designer and landscape architect, and I run April Owens Design LLC, and we are a B Corp that funds the Habitat Corridor project. So backing up, resilient landscapes, John talked about this quite a bit, but I really want to reiterate that it's the systems thinking orientation. Like looking at, we run to drought, we run to fire, we run to biodiversity in California, and I think as humans just all over the country, but really thinking about that this California really is, we are in drought regimes, we are in fire regimes, and we are losing biodiversity with development. So just thinking of it as a broader picture versus just having action on each of these pieces. Oh my gosh, there's a fire. We're going to take all of our landscape. Oh my gosh, there's drought. We're going to take out our, so we really need to think of this in a broader picture. I design in sustainability. So keeping water on site, thinking about permeable surfaces, where are our local materials, and how we can hydrate our plants with the best use of the best use of our resources. First, I'm going to jump in and back up Mimi's amazing talk about like what the rules are and what you should do, and show you some easy ways to do this. Like that's how I've been adapting my talk. So this is 0 to 5. 0 to 5 is so questionable to folks. Like, how do I take out all my plants and put in like rock? And there's so many beautiful ways you can do this. Steel edging is a long-lasting material. So like this is a deck to a step to some material. So there's a lot of different ways to be creative in this space in the 0 to 5. It doesn't have to be like Mimi said, like there's no lava rock anymore. There's all kinds of wonderful ways to bring in the 0 to 5 non-combustible zone with really beautiful materials. This landscape we'll look at a little bit more, but this is a parking court. So incorporating that whole reality into your front landscape. Here is one we were just putting in. I thought I'd show you. We added in, so we lean on base rock and compacted base rock instead of landscape fabric. You could definitely use landscape fabric under your rock material in the front landscape. We just find that keeps weeds down better with a lower cost and a lower forward cost to whoever, like, I don't know if any of you have had to rip out landscape fabric and replace anything. So, and then this is like a small island that you can have in your landscape. Another driveway court with steel edging, a little bit of planting in this 0 to 5 with some beautiful Trinity pebble, Juncus patens. There's a few plants that we'll bring up, but that as long as you keep them well hydrated and cut back and maintained, you could have a little green in there. Again, in the 0 to 5, here's a landscape that you can see as we started in the top right corner. This was in installation last year. We put in this beautiful Flagstone pathway. We were adding in this nice, well-maintained little island in the front, and looking at Flagstone with crushed rock material or rock material. And then the bottom picture is after a year. So just reminding yourself that plants need to be planted appropriately distanced from each other. And I have to always learn this. Like I always remind myself of this constantly. So just I know that the view is a little different, but you'll see like zero, zero planting to like a very vibrant garden pretty quickly. So just remember that in 0 to 5, or well, this is like 5 to 30, but in 0 to 5, if you're going to do a little bit of planting, you need to like make sure you know how big the plants are going to be, and blending with 5 to 30 as we're looking at this landscape. 5 to 30, you know, think about how far apart things are going to be. This also is a rebuild. So like we've talked about, like make sure, like if your home, like it is a hardy board construction, you have a lot more wiggle room with this kind of information, you're planting in your landscape. Same landscape. We did a fun mix of, you know, you don't have to have just one rock. You can have a lot of different rocks in there. So this is our cobble mix, which is like 3 inch, 1.5 inch, 2 inch, and like minus mix. So, you know, don't feel like you have to have just one type of rock along. And this is a slide also that I try to push architects. So the architect didn't think about foundation plantings. So architects tend to think that we are going to have like planting, like foundation plantings, but we don't have foundation plantings anymore. So this is another spot where we're pushing folks to think about what this looks like, how can we make this look a little nicer. Design 0 to 5. This is an area where drainage is an issue. A lot of times we oftentimes find water running in existing homes, water running up against homes. So we often put in French drains, and French drains can turn into swales. And this is a picture before and after where before this research and all this work I've been doing with the Resilient Landscape Coalition, we did the image on the left where we had mulch against the house. Again, this was a Firewise construction hardened home, but we went back in and added pebble and took out the mulch. So there's some really easy fixes that you can do to correct mulch. The mulch just went out further. We brought in pebble and we corrected this so it was more resilient and Firewise in that 0 to 5. Swales are just a low place or depression in the landscape, and you just want to make sure they drain and went away from the home. There's some other really beautiful ways to approach this 0 to 5. There's a few plants that you can add in. Diamondia, it's not native, but it's a little ground cover that works well. Like thyme, thyme uses a lot of water, so just think about your water resources. There's also a lot of native succulents that work really well in this space around boulders and rock steps and boulders. So getting into the 5 to 30, so the 0 to 5, there's so many options, and it's just really playing around with different textures and rocks and things. 5 to 30 is really your area to experience a broader landscape. So there's some native turf options, but we've been using native turf grasses by Delta bluegrass, that they need a significant amount of water to get established. So just make sure that you're doing it in the fall when you have water resources. Do not plant these in the spring. So we're heading into fall. This is the time for planting. However, make sure that when you're thinking about adding any of these turf grasses that are native and they're low water use, but to get established, they need some time. These are concrete pavers with this Trinity crushed rock. So in 5 to 30, this is an area where you can use these beautiful pathways and create this like a beautiful garden, as long as it's well maintained and well hydrated. And so native plants, California native plants, are really the first step in that, because they're evolved to not need so much water. But this zone is where you want to put a little extra water in to make it it's safer for your landscape especially if you're in a fire severity zone. So this is monkey flower and buckwheat that have amazing biodiversity benefits. And this is a really interesting project we did up in Healdsburg, which might relate to Sonoma Valley very well, because they had a very high water level. And so we actually raised this pathway up with drain rock and this flagstone so that it's over the garden. So any time that there's so much water in the garden, the pathway is still accessible. So it really framed this landscape really well. And I know that Sonoma Valley has major groundwater issues up and down. So I think this would be a wonderful approach to your landscape maybe you're in the middle of the valley and your garden gets flooded sometimes, but also is really dry in the summer. So here's where John talked about this too, and Mimi too, but like really thinking about your plant community. It's important to keep plants optimally hydrated. And so really looking into like what your plant communities are, what are the plants in that, and are there any plants locally adapted to your region? This is a nice example of Sonoma sage, Salvia sonomensis. This is a cultivar bee's bliss. However, it's adapted to the Sonoma Valley. So that just looking into your plant materials, you all in Sonoma Valley have many different plant communities, and riparian is along that source as well. But I just focused on more sun oriented. So Oakwoodland, Oak Savannah, and Chaparral are maybe plant communities that you could lean on in your residential landscapes. But use a little more water in this zone. 5 to 30 is where you hydrate a little bit more. I'm finding that we used to not hydrate in the summer after 2 years, and we're needing to hydrate a little bit more as the climate is changing. Another really wonderful resource is calscape.org, and I'm not going to click on it and get all over there, but I just wanted to show you what you get out of calscape.org. All you do is put in your area or you put in a plant, and it gives you what the plants are that work well, how to maintain them, how big they get, what they are, and also this wonderful level of biodiversity, which is your butterflies and your bees and your birds. So I highly recommend heading over to calscape.org and just putting your address, putting in a plant that you're interested in. It's an amazing resource. I use it all the time as a landscape designer, and it's so fun to see like hair streak and these white line sphinx butterflies. Like, look that up because they are really neat. Design 5 to 30. It's again some creative ideas. We have a client that did these wonderful 12 by 12, or I think they were 25 by 24 papers. 2 by 2, 24 by 20 papers with the snow mow fescue turf, again with the native turf. Play around. This is a beautiful decomposed granite pathway. They used a binder to make sure it doesn't don't use decomposed granite without some kind of binder, because it just gets up in your shoes. This was local. This is above you all in the Sonoma Valley, but the Bennett Ridge area, we've done a lot of landscapes, and there's a lot of on-site rock material as well. Think about sinking it. How would we keep our water on site and not just drain it into the creeks and such? So like we want to fill our aquifer. So this was on the left here is a rain garden that you can't even see. So the left is what it is, and the right is how we hide it. And it's just kind of a patio, but it's all the rain gutters are sinking in and going down into this patio space. again, with some beautiful swales with tons of native plants. And then even the idea of I call it a path swale. So underneath this path is some drainage material and a lot of drain rock. So you're soaking things in, but you're still walking on top of them. So it doesn't have to be a swale on top like that you see. It can be like underground. We're sinking it in, moving the water away from the house. This is an idea. Like, I know that a lot of folks are against manzanitas, but they are a vital habitat plant in the winter for hummingbirds. If you love your hummingbirds, like don't keep feeding them in their little feeders. Make sure you get manzanita on your site. However, this is a way to create, this is along a parking court. Manzanitas can really appreciate crushed gravel around them. So you can separate them out, get your winter habitat, and also create a Firewise landscape. Another wonderful way, inexpensive pathways. This is just drain rock. A quarter of the price of that fancy pretty rock that I was just showing ahead of these slides. Giving some space in the landscape with these lovely pathways. Here is a lawn conversion project. I apologize for the different view in this landscape, but this was just a little like grassy area, and we converted. This is very, very new, and these plants have like really created a lot of cover since then. However, this is a way to think about your landscape as you're looking at it. So there's the 0 to 5. If you can see, this is a nice pathway with steel edging and flagstone. And then there's some drainage elements with some swales running through the landscape with some wonderful boulders, and then some wonderful groupings and islands of plants throughout the garden. And this is how we approach looking at these landscapes. Another small space. This is a very small patch of lawn with boxwood. So like to the left is boxwood grass. And then to the right is what we did with it. And we took out the boxwood, we got rid of the grass, and we created a little lovely front patio and a lot of native plants that are just covered. The clients are always like, the bumblebees and the hummingbirds are just filling our space. So moving on to design 30 to 100, so we'll talk about a little bit about habitat gardening in a minute, but creating landing pads. So you want, and just for the calm of the aesthetic, you want groups of plants 3 to 5, and just try to think of that. And you want islands separated by question mark. And here we have by rock walls, that those were local. So this was up on Bennett Ridge, and there was a rock everywhere we dug, everywhere on the landscape. So we had plenty of rock, but think about separated by question mark, and we can talk about that a little bit more. If you look back to the house, like backing up to there, you can see that they've cleaned up their trees. There's a lot of space as they're heading out from the home. So 30 to 100 really is a place where we can add more habitat, but also you need to, this slide helps you look at like as how you're moving out from your home. So larger groups of shrubs. This is elderberry, a go-to for me. And when it gets too big, we just cut it back to the ground and it comes back vibrantly again. This is in the Marquest area, a very hot site with low water, low irrigation, and it's covered with habitat. So this plant, Simpicus mexicana, really is adaptable to many sites. So just diving in quickly-ish to some shrubs that just work everywhere, because I know that a lot of you are all over the county. So I just wanted to give you some go-tos. Toyon is beautiful. This plant, this is a picture from San Francisco Bay. However, I find that Toyon works in, I can't think of a place that doesn't work in one of our landscapes, and we've created them all over California. Supports birds, butterflies, bees, and is a great screening shrub that can be tended, that can take a lot of maintenance, can be cut back hard. And that's, I think, what my other two cohorts were talking about, Mimi and John, is that you need plants that you can reinvigorate, and Toyon is one of those. California currant is a beautiful winter blooming habitat plant. Is more part shade to shade. However, it is very tolerant of maintenance as well. Coffeeberry, I've learned just in the last little while that I feel like coffeeberry, talking about Sonoma Valley, it doesn't tend to love super hot, and it needs a little water. So I just want to warn you that, like, this is a great screening shrub for Sonoma Valley, but just give it a little, like in your zone, give it a little extra water and give it a little more protection. And then we talked about, I think that we've talked a little bit about what to use between the islands and the 5 to 30, but now that we're like 30 to 100, like you can have these islands of plants, and what do you put in between them? It's approved by the UCCE folks that in this 30 to 100, you can actually use arbor mulch in between the islands. You can also, in all the zones, like the 5 to 30 to 30 to 100, gravel, rock, pebble, and also well-tended grasses that are hydrated and obviously mowed down, like Mimi said, to 4 inches or less. So if you're gonna let your grass go to, what we find with the Festica rubra and the Carex panza and some of these native grasses, if you're not gonna hydrate them, you're gonna let them go summer dormant. It needs to be out of probably to the 30 to 100 zone. There's another plant called Lithia, Phyla Notiflora, that is a wonderful ground cover that's very seasonal. It would be great in between these islands in 30 to 100 and even in 5 to 30. It attracts so many bees and pollinators that just make sure I have it out in my yard in between my flagstone. And sometimes in the summer, we're like, oh, there's so many bees around, like we have to step carefully. So just if you have kids running on the lawn and things like that, just be cautious of this plant, but it's just a lovely, and the butterflies just go gangbusters after it. So hydrating native plants is contentious, I have to admit, and I don't know how I feel about all of it. We're just learning. So this is our garden with the UC Master Gardeners and many other partners at the Living Learning Landscapes on along the Santa Rosa JC campus. It's a place that you can go, livinglearninglandscape.com. You can find out our work days or just go out there. It's been a really vital project. And right now, all the gardens are on this grid of drip. And there's pluses and minuses. And I invite you to come on out and get in contact with me and find out more about how this all works and what the best way to hydrate your plants are. There's also MP rotators, which are low water use sprinklers, which again are contentious with me because when the plants get big, then you can't go over them. So so irrigation in the garden is interesting. If you have a small garden, think about hand watering and getting to know your garden. So there's a lot of ways to hydrate plants, and it's, it's definitely a place to dive in. And if you want to learn more, please reach out to me or look into livinglearninglandscapes.com, because we're really trying to figure this all out. So for biodiversity, you need food, cover, water. That's like a habitat garden. It's super easy. You need the native plants, you need a little bit of water, and you need some cover. It's a very simple solution. Oftentimes it's just even in a small garden, you have a few shrubs like coffeeberry or toyon. You have a little bit of water, either it's like a little nice habitat fountain or just a boulder that has a little water in it. And you make sure this time of year when things are really dry to make sure that you have some water out there for your birds and bees and butterflies. Some tips for successful habitat planting. Just some easy tips, like many types of flowers, long, tubular, aster type. If you build it, they will come. Use natives in a little group. It's going to happen. Large groupings. If you have a larger landscape, you can create these pollinator targets. Flowering at different times. Think about that. John talked about some Douglas Tallamy's book that will help you a lot with all that. And then plants that provide both nectar and pollen sources. And this is super important with monarchs and all the butterflies. So it's definitely like another level if you want to create a butterfly garden. And then I always say, wait for the delight. Like this is my little red bud in my little front yard. It took this little sweetheart 3 years to put its energy into its roots, and finally it bloomed, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's blooming. So just give natives the time that they're adapted to put their roots down and really dive deep to get the water, and then they will create the overstory for you. And don't move them, please. Like I encourage you. I've killed so many plants by moving them. So just they send their roots down so quickly. Try to figure out the right place for your plant, like Mimi was saying, and then let it grow. So Jennifer is going to send us off, but I love this photo in Sonoma County of the Dutchman's pipe that supports the Dutchman's pipe vine swallowtail caterpillars. Seeing the whole cycle of life is so exciting. This is actually my mom's house, who's a big volunteer at the Habitat Corridor Project, but we love watching the very hungry caterpillars come alive in the spring. And I just encourage you to create one of these resilient landscapes so that you can have this kind of delight in your garden. And that is my talk. I'm excited to hear your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, April.
Sure.
And thank you, John. And thank you, Mimi, as well. So this is the part of the presentation where we switch gears and we focus on your questions. And just as a reminder, you will get an email which will have a link to the recording of this and the PowerPoint slides. And there was a request for all the list of links that I was putting in the chat. So you will also get that. And in a few weeks, we're going to send a survey to you all. And just to gauge how helpful was this for you? Were you inspired? Did you go change something? Did you inspire others, etc.? So please help us out and fill that out so we can continue to improve what we do. Okay, and just a reminder that Resilient Landscapes Coalition is made up of Habitat Corridor Project, Master Gardeners, Sonoma Ecology Center, and Fire Safe Sonoma. Okay, so get to the questions.
Yay.
And Jen, sorry, I'm going to start off with an apology. I was over enthusiastic and I was answering a few questions before this. So there are a couple of them, like you might want to start with Gwen Watson's question about coyote mint, which I answered. And then there's another one about pruning coyote. Well, I said pruning coyote mint, and then island planting. So
sure, that's a great segue. Yeah, great way to structure that. So there was a question about specific plant, Russian River coyote mint. And Gwen says they planted them 3 falls ago, but now they seem to be dying and very dry. although they get regular drip irrigation. So do they die after a few years?
They love to be cut back hard. So that is a plant that John has a lovely, like, in our maintenance thing, like, but I've found that coyote mint really needs like a nice hard cutting almost every year, right, John?
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think they benefit. I have done it every other year too, but I think every year they respond to very well. I would also say that mine this year are not, I showed that photo that was a coyote mint at the very beginning of my presentation. That very plant did not bloom as well this year as previous years. And I think, and I find that with California fuchsia as well. I think the very low precipitation over the winter impacted how plants, not surprisingly, grew, even though I do irrigate through the summer, although conservatively.
Sparingly.
Plants are just not, I don't think, they're not enjoying this season because of a very dry winter.
And then the crazy heat wave.
Yeah.
I have to say, my coyote mint, which do not look as gorgeous as John's up in hot Cloverdale, but they're tough. They went through that extreme heat wave, and it got to 115 a couple days in Cloverdale in a while. Bookended by 108 and a couple 108 and a couple 109 on either end. Didn't even look like it, didn't phase them at all.
So when we say cut back hard, it can depend. Some plants like California fuchsia, Epilobium, California fuchsia, which is a great hummingbird plant. Those actually need to be cut back to within an inch of the ground, whereas coyote mint, and John, all of you may know, I have some new coyote mint. I only trimmed it back like a third of the length of the stems. So anyway.
And I go to about
finding
4 to 6 inches.
They're happy to go down, right?
Yeah, I transplanted some and cut them back to like 4 inches and came back gangbusters.
It's kind of like California fuchsia. They appreciate a really hard cut.
Yeah.
I
So
wasn't
But in the
they'd be
winter, it's
really-
like, don't do it in the summer when it's super hot. Make sure
Yeah.
you're doing it when there's some moisture.
But I wasn't really sure how well they'd thrive in hot sun, full western exposure up in Cloverdale. I've got them in a little meadow, and I think because they have their feet covered a little with the grasses, they're doing fine, and they poke out their flowers from the grasses. It's quite charming.
So we love coyote mint. But we probably
We should move
But
on.
it's a
Yeah.
great-
We love-
Evidenced by that we all have it in our garden.
it's a great butterfly plant. I had tons of butterflies on it.
Yeah.
So then another one that I answered, when you're talking about planting in islands, what size islands are you talking about? And I said, it's a great question. It hasn't been definitively answered. It depends on what plants are in the island, how well they're maintained, how close they are to the house, and whether the pathways between the islands are well maintained and non-combustible. And then we may want to, I know that I've read in some places, what is it, like 75 square feet, which would be like 7 by 10. I have islands that are bigger than that, like even 7 by 20, but I have stepping stones within, and I kind of keep open spaces in the plants, but not full on non-flammable pathways.
I think the overall concept is, and because we don't have specific direction yet on specific widths that those beds should be, but there's been lots of heated discussion that we've had over the years on that topic, is really to start just thinking about the concept, about breaking up your planting areas. So you're breaking up the flow of fire to your home. And it really depends on how big your landscape is. And I mean, everyone's going to have to make their own personal decisions about what works in their home landscape. So.
And that's
We're
why I
still
brought
putting
up
that there,
the home hardening piece. So that slide that I had with the little island close to the home, they had their home is hardened to the most defensible way, and so you have that risk assessment however your home is.
And April, someone did have a question about that because you used the term, there's some wiggle room,
Yes.
depending on hardy board. So they were like, can you define that maybe?
I can't define wiggle room. I in that home, that was a rebuild from the 2017 fires. So their home was rebuilt in like as best as they could with home hardening. So we had some space, like they wanted a little bit of planting closer to the home, and we felt safe to do that. and using plants that we cut back and maintain very carefully.
And I think the context you were showing, April, it looked like, maybe it wasn't 5 feet free because you had the wiggle room, so to speak. It was more like 3 feet or something like that. But there was still some spacing between the planting and the home. I think those a couple of those islands, because I had seen the question about island size, and as April was showing some of her landscapes, and I've seen them live and in person as well. And I would say that the smaller ones tend to be around that sort of 50 to 75 square feet, 5 by 10, 7.5 by 10. And then farther from the house, they can become, bigger.
That was a
Again, it
very
all
small
depends
island.
on risk assessment and your.
Yeah.
The one thing I want to say about the home hardening and wiggle room is, if you have concrete foundation, concrete paneling, and the windows are far high above and they're double paned, you probably could get away with some open habit plants or something that really doesn't have much that could burn. But the problem is if you have windows nearby and you have a big shrub that catches on fire, the windows can actually break, or and then the fire can get in. So you have to think worst case scenario. If this catches on fire, what might happen?
I feel like there were some threads of some other questions that we left for answering live in the session. Everybody has to assess their own risk. I live in a very high fire severity zone. On a slope, part of my defensible space is the Weedy. I have a fully implemented 0 to 5 foot zone. And if I have some, non-woody container, plants like some terracotta pots that might have some succulents or some herbaceous perennials in that zone, I'm moving them out of that zone, even though that's probably not a significant risk on a red flag warning day or if I'm evacuating. So, everybody's got to make their own decision about what risk they can accept and that they have in their home landscape. April showed some pictures and there were some questions about, I love the way Bear Tough raised it. Wait,
I haven't seen
said
them.
no organic materials in zone 0, but April showed a picture with some juncus in there. Juncus is non-woody, and so if you've assessed your risk factor and you are bound to determine to have some plants in zone 0, and many people are, then perennial or succulents are your best options below 3 feet. You're going to have to stay on your maintenance though, because those leaves will tend to accumulate there. And if you're going to do it, make sure you're committing to your maintenance and you're keeping that cleaned out, especially during fire season, which seems to run like from May to November now. I feel like it's a 6-month fire season. There are
I'm just a pusher of like a little tiny bit. So I'm just trying to show people reality of
so the question from Sue about are succulents considered combustible? They do have high moisture content in their leaves. So if they do ignite, they ignite and burn more slowly. There's some really sad pictures of burned succulents from the Tubbs fire. So, they are organic, so they may burn, but it is, probably less likely. They're not this big woody mass with a bunch of dead twiggy, branches and leaf, captured in the center of it that would directly ignite a home. But again, weigh your risk factor. So I think hopefully that addressed Berta's question about no organic materials in zone 0, and then also Sue's question around succulents. And is that any other thoughts on that?
No, I think that covered it well.
I was looking at the question. One of my favorites is what to do. Why not Manzanita, or why Manzanita? And you guys should run with that one.
I think I covered that pretty well. I mean, it's important in the winter, and I think that the context that I had, but maybe I already shared my context, so maybe.
Well, okay, so I happen to be looking at a Napa County of Napa site on defensible space today, and they're prohibiting Manzanita. There's a lot of controversy on this topic. And the position of the University of California Cooperative Extension is any plant can burn. We don't really advocate for vilifying specific plant species or providing plant lists, because, you know, it really creates this false sense of security. I mean, the key is, where are you putting it? How are you maintaining it? What's the overall design of your garden? Manzanitas are an incredibly important habitat plant that April talked about. And that Pacific Mist Manzanita, that's a gorgeous ground cover. So Brianna, where is it? Is it in 30 to 100 or is it in 5 to 30? It's low to the ground, so it's not going to transmit fire as long as you don't let it climb up the oak trees that it's planted under. It's not going to transmit fire up into the canopy, which is the concern in 5 to 30 and 30 to 100. Maintain it well. And that's a really great application in an oak grove, because they both have the same water use requirements, which is minimal water in the summer period. You might want to maintain it with some minor irrigation, but you don't want to over irrigate, because that can threaten the oaks. If it is in a closer zone to your house. But, I think that's a reasonable approach to take. I don't know what Ellie is looking like she's itching to weigh.
You know me too well. The reason that Manzanita gets a bad name in the fire professional world is that the actual wood of Manzanita, once it does catch fire, has very high heat. It's a very high heat. It's a very hard wood, and it may take a while to actually catch on fire, but it's very hot and it can burn for a very long time. So they like to dislike it. Manzanita in the wild, not maintained, especially a Manzanita shrub, can if it's got grasses underneath it, which typically non-native grasses, which dry up, they catch fire and it catches the Manzanita on fire, and then it's very, very, very hard to put out. So in the wild, Manzanita can be a problem, but even a Manzanita shrub of some size, if it's a specimen and is pruned up really nicely and things are kept low down below, so that they won't catch it on fire, it's a perfectly awesome plant. And I have some in my 5 to 30, but I'm keeping it separate from other plants.
As do I. And you can prune them beautifully. That you
And
really
John has
can
really
do some
nice
thinning and removing those lower branches and kind of just snapping off any smaller dead twigs that develop. But they can prune beautifully as a specimen shrub. So I just think if you do it with a lens towards properly maintaining it and keeping it healthy and happy, then.
And I just have one thought seeing this, her note about Pacific. I left it, but make sure that you try to think of, try to get Manzanitas that are local to your plant community. So McMahon Manzanita is more West County. There's Manzanita Arctocepha glauca that's more interior. So you're just adding more habitat. If you're going to invest in a Manzanita, learn what the Manzanita specimen is local to your area and get one of those.
Yeah, but the nice thing about Pacific Mist is it'll go 10 feet wide.
Right,
So
but it's more
territory.
Southern California, so it's not from around here.
Yeah, I've seen it really beautifully planted in like Petaluma. I mean,
it's more. So just think about where those plants come from too.
Look at calscape.org. They will tell you where what by your zip code. Yeah, no zip code, area code.
So it looks like there's also a great question series around April for you around hardscape asked questions like, how do you keep flagstone areas from becoming uneven tripping hazards? She's heard of laying a thin layer of concrete, but all that seems very expensive for elder gardens ideas. And Camille asking, can I put down compacted base rock in my zone 0 area and leave that open to the elements while I save for the funds for pebble material? Also, is there pebble rock material to avoid?
Yeah, so we really, we've been installing these gardens for at least 10 years, and we lean on compacted base rock for 3 inches at least, and then have a thin layer of, we call it pretty rock, but it's the more expensive rock on top, and it's walkable. And we find that if you have gophers, you want to do gopher wire underneath that, because gophers mess with us big time. So I've really had some good experience. The weeds come in from the top, so I don't feel like there's anything you could do landscape fabric or anything underneath that would help with the weeds that come in from the birds pooping on your hardscape. So, but it's more permeable and inexpensive, and you don't leave the landscape fabric to your next generation to have to pull that up. I don't know.
And
if anybody
landscape
else
fabric
has
too has, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was going to say the landscape fabric has a real disadvantage of sort of disconnecting the life of the soil underneath it with the surface where the organic matter, the leaf litter is. So you're not able to get that earthworm feeding up and down near the surface of the soil. But having been working around landscapes and gardens all my life, yeah, there's nothing worse than old fabric that somebody else put in.
Horrible.
So it solves a problem very temporarily and leaves a big problem for the future, as you're saying.
Yeah.
Are
Can I
we,
add some, I loved Camille's question around,
Can
Can I
we
start
just
with putting some-
before, but can we go to Vicky's
yeah,
question?
I just wanted to make one comment, if you don't mind. Because I was talking to a UC fire advisor recently, and you know, for a lot of folks, it's a lot to take on, and especially implementing the 0 to 5. And her suggestion was start on your side of your house that has your biggest fire threat. I know what the side of my house is that's my biggest potential fire threat, and start on that side. And if you know, if you do it over a couple of seasons to integrate these suggestions in, that's a great start. And I think your approach to doing the compacted base rock now is a great strategy. And when you've got some more funds later, you can make it look more beautiful.
So yeah, and that fits perfectly, I think, with what Vicky's asking. How do you keep flagstone areas from becoming uneven? Because if you just lay the flagstone right on the dirt, then that's, you know, various things will come up from below and move them around, whether they're gophers or tree roots or whatever. So you actually do need to dig the soil out a bit, at least 2 to 3 inches, and get compacted base rock, if nothing else, and gopher wire.
Gopher wire.
Yeah, and so if it's a small area, you can get someone or yourself compact with one of those, you know, foot square metal, fairly heavy compactors, and just really go over it thoroughly, and then put a very thin layer of sand to level, and then put the flagstones on top. But you kind of can't you can't avoid the tripping hazard if you don't get the base rock. At least concrete is I wouldn't do concrete. You have to put base rock for concrete as well, essentially.
But if you do already have concrete, don't bust out all the concrete.
Oh, right.
Like think about, like we just did a patio where we had a concrete pad. We added base rock and a little bit of pretty rock. So just like don't just like be busting out things too.
Yeah, and that helps with because Vicky, that's why I'm sorry to interrupt you when I did, Mimi, but I thought Vicky, she had asked the question previously, and it's a really good point that it's what we're talking about can be very expensive. And for elder gardeners and anybody really.
Keep it simple. Keep it simple.
Yeah, start with some baby steps. And then it looks like our last question from Mary is county code prohibiting vegetation 10 feet from chimney. This applies to kitchen stove exhaust pipe. I believe it's just, it doesn't.
I think it's just the potential for anything to create sparks or heat.
Got it.
Of any kind. Yeah, I mean, I have a chimney that I never use and probably will never use. You know, I mean, if you have a decommissioned, you know, it's not the chimney itself. It's the potential for heat or sparks.
And look at that, 7:29, and we finished.
What? Great timing.
Jen, do you want to share your last slide just so people can see?
Oh, sure. John's got that. But yeah, just visit our website if you want to dive deeper into any of our resources, and maybe sign up for that maintenance workshop that I will be teaching. It's November 11, 5:30. Please pre-register. If you were, you know, maybe not recognizing all the terms we used about shearing and shaping up and all these things, what to do with plants. So I provide a lot more tips and tricks. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists, presenters, and thank you, participants.
Thank you, team.
Thank you, everybody.
That was
Thanks,
lovely.
everyone.
As everyone's leaving, I just want to say irrigation is a really big conversation, and we're having the conversation. But you do need to irrigate your plants when you first put them in, and drip can really work for the first 2 or 3
Yes.
years, even though it can drive you crazy. But please don't worry that you can take care of these things with irrigation. Okay.
I'm
That
sorry
was
if
my-
I made that confusing. I could do a whole workshop on that.
We should add that to our repertoire.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
you.